When we picture medieval Europe, we often imagine castles, knights, and markets, but rarely do we stop to think about hair. Yet in a world without electric lights, without the noise of modern fashion, haircuts held their own quiet power. They were not simply styles of vanity. They were signals of identity, markers of profession, signs of age, rank, and belonging. Some were practical, some were symbolic, and some to our modern eyes look so unusual that they seem almost strange. Even comical in villages and towns, scissors were few, razors were simple, and mirrors were rare. Yet from these humble tools came styles that carried meaning far beyond appearance. A haircut could tell whether a man was a soldier or a servant, a noble or a craftsman. Women's hair could reveal marital status, wealth, or tradition. And throughout the centuries, trends shifted quietly, influenced by climate, custom, and even a WTO walk through a medieval street was to see hair everywhere, cropped close, shaved in circles, left long in braids, or cut in curious patterns. Each head told a story, each strand part of the fabric of daily life. What may seem unusual now was, in its own time, ordinary, practical, and full of meaning to us. Oh, let us take a calm journey through this forgotten side of medieval life, exploring the strange haircuts of Europe, styles that have long since faded but still whisper of the world that created them. In the quiet heart of medieval Europe, where stone cottages leaned together along narrow lanes and smoke rose steadily from thatched rooftops, identity was not worn in glittering jewels or fine silks, but in the small and ordinary details of daily life. Among these, hair stood out as one of the simplest yet most telling signs of who a person was. A haircut was never only about appearance. It was a language, silent but legible, one that neighbors could read with a glance. In villages where everyone knew everyone else, a man's cut or a woman's braid spoke volumes before a single word was exchanged. Tools were modest. Razors were little more than sharpened steel, scissors heavy and rough compared to the polished instruments of later centuries. Combs were carved from bone or wood, their teeth thick, sometimes uneven. Mirrors, when they existed, were small pieces of polished metal or faint reflections in water. Yet even with such simplicity, villagers shaped their hair with care, not for fashion alone, but because in a world of hierarchy and duty, hair revealed place. For men, the most common styles were plain, born of necessity. Farmers often wore their hair short, cut unevenly by a wife, a brother, or sometimes by their own hand, for long locks would catch in tools, grow heavy with sweat, or gather dust and straw in the fields. These short cuts were rarely neat, but neatness mattered less than practicality. Still, even the roughest cut could speak of diligence. Hair kept from falling into eyes meant work was constant, duties fulfilled. To leave hair untrimmed for too long was to signal neglect, something a watchful community would not fail to notice. Among craftsmen, hair bore marks of pride in trade. A smith, standing by his forge, often tied his hair back with strips of leather to keep sparks from catching. A miller might crop his hair close, for the constant dust of ground grain clung to everything, and shorter hair was easier to wash clean in the stream at day's end. Carpenters, masons, and cobblers too shaped their hair not with elegance, but with thought to their labor. Each head reflected the rhythm of work, the daily need to balance cleanliness, comfort, and the dignity of one's role. For women, hair carried even greater meaning. In villages, where clothing was simple and possessions few, hair was one of the most visible markers of identity. Young girls often wore their hair long, brushed smooth, and sometimes braided loosely down their backs. This length was not only a sign of youth, but of freedom from responsibility, a stage of life before the duties of marriage and household pressed heavily. Once married, many women covered their hair with simple veils, caps, or kerchiefs, sometimes leaving braids tucked beneath, sometimes showing only a hint of hair at the temples. The act of covering was less about fashion and more about respectability. To see a married woman with uncovered hair was unusual, a sign that she stepped outside the expectations of her time. There were also small but telling differences between classes. A noble woman passing through a village might wear her hair braided intricately, adorned with ribbons or beads, her coverings finer and brighter. Her style marked her as someone apart, a life of leisure and servants. By contrast, the village woman's braid was practical, tied simply, with no adornment but the strength of her own hands. Yet in the quiet dignity of these modest styles lay the mark of endurance. Their beauty was not in ornament, but in usefulness. Their grace not in polish, but in the way they fit the rhythm of daily labor. Children's hair told its own stories. Boys often wore simple bowl cuts, trimmed roughly around the head by a parent with little thought for symmetry. The uneven edges, sometimes jagged, sometimes too short in places, gave them the look of youth, a reminder that their lives were not yet bound by the duties of adulthood. Girls wore their hair longer, sometimes left loose, sometimes gathered in small braids, their strands catching sunlight as they played in fields or darted through village lanes. These styles, though simple, carried the gentle warmth of community, the sense that a child's hair was shaped not for beauty but for care. By the same hands that mended clothing or baked bread, what strikes us today as unusual were styles that seemed ordinary to them. Shaved crowns, uneven cuts, or blunt fringes, to our eyes, strange, even crude. But in their context, they spoke clearly. A shaved crown, for instance, might mark a man who had taken service in a monastery or simply followed the habit of nearby towns. An uneven cut was not a failure, but the sign of a home-trimmed style, done by firelight at the end of a long week. A blunt fringe across the forehead, seen in portraits and manuscripts, was fashionable in its time, a small way of signaling youth or modest adherence to current trends. These styles, though strange to us, were part of the living language of the village. Each variation understood, each signal recognized. The rhythm of hair was tied, too, to the rhythm of seasons. In summer, cuts grew shorter, hair cropped closer to the head to bring relief from heat and sweat. In winter, hair was left longer, a natural shield against the cold, pulled under caps or tucked into collars of wool. Just as the fields followed the cycles of planting and harvest, so too did the villagers' hair mirror the needs of survival. No one thought of it as fashion in the modern sense. It was simply the way of life, another layer of adaptation to the world around them. Even grooming carried symbolic weight. To comb one's hair before walking into the village square, to smooth it down before Sunday gatherings, was a way of presenting oneself to others, of showing dignity and respect. In an age when baths were rare and soap scarce, clean and managed hair was a quiet but powerful sign of self-respect. Neighbors noticed, and in communities where reputation meant survival, these small signals mattered deeply. To walk into a medieval village was therefore to step into a gallery of haircuts, each ordinary, each meaningful, each carrying its own quiet message. Farmers cropped short, craftsmen tied back, children unevenly trimmed, women braided or veiled, noble travelers adorned. All part of a tapestry of identity that revealed who people were without words. What seems unusual to us today was simply life to them, practical, symbolic, and deeply human. And so, hair in medieval villages was never only about style. It was about identity, woven into the fabric of daily life. It was about belonging, signaling to neighbors and strangers alike one's place in the world. It was about survival, shaped by labor, climate, and necessity. And though the cuts may seem strange now, their meaning remains clear. Hair was a mirror of life, quiet but enduring, another strand in the great weave of history. In medieval Europe, every glance carried meaning, every garment, every gesture, and even every strand of hair could reveal where a person belonged in the silent hierarchy that ordered society. Hair was more than a matter of beauty. It was a language of rank. To walk through a medieval town was to see differences woven not only into clothing and posture, but also into hair itself. For style and care reflected wealth, work, and position in ways more telling than words. Among the nobility, hair became a canvas of refinement. Lords, knights, and ladies did not labor in the fields. Their lives, though not free of responsibility, were shaped by privilege and expectation. With access to finer tools, sharper shears, polished mirrors, combs carved from ivory or horn, their haircuts displayed a level of attention impossible for common villagers. Noblemen often wore their hair longer, cut neatly to frame the face, brushed and perfumed when oils were available. A knight preparing for a feast might sit while a servant trimmed his hair evenly, smoothing the edges so that his appearance matched his station. Ladies of rank wore their hair with even greater care, braiding it intricately, weaving ribbons, or covering it with delicate veils that hinted at the luxury of the hair beneath. The effort required servants and time, both of which declared wealth as loudly as silk gowns or golden rings. Merchants and townsfolk occupied a middle ground. They lacked the luxury of constant attendance, but they also lived above the level of peasants. Their haircuts reflected this balance: neat, respectable, but rarely elaborate. A prosperous merchant might keep his hair trimmed close, combed carefully each morning, a style simple enough to manage but polished enough to signal dignity. His wife might braid her hair in orderly patterns, binding it with cloth bands dyed in modest colors, displaying taste without extravagance. Their styles carried a message: stability, respect, a claim to rising status within the growing towns of Europe. For peasants, hair was above all else practical. Farmers and laborers cut their hair short when possible, not with precision, but with function in mind. Uneven edges, blunt fringes, and rough shearing were common, for haircuts were done by family members or by the individual himself, using tools meant for other tasks. These cuts, though simple, told a clear story, a life lived in fields and workshops where appearances bowed to the demands of survival. Women among the peasantry braided their hair plainly or covered it with kerchiefs, often using scraps of cloth, for coverings protected hair from smoke, dirt, and weather. Their styles were not meant to impress, but to endure, shaped by necessity rather than fashion. The most striking contrasts often appeared at gatherings, fairs, markets, or festivals, when people of different classes stood side by side. A noblewoman passing through a marketplace with her hair styled in intricate coils might be watched with quiet curiosity by peasant women whose hair was tied back simply. A knight's neatly trimmed locks might draw the eyes of farmers who wore bowl cuts hacked unevenly across their foreheads. These moments revealed how deeply class marked every detail, even in something as seemingly ordinary as hair. The unusual cuts of peasants might have seemed crude to nobles, while the elaborate styles of nobles might have seemed unnecessary to peasants. Each class saw the other as different, and hair was one of the most visible signals of that divide. Children reflected this hierarchy too. Noble children often had their hair carefully shaped, for even in youth they were expected to carry the appearance of their station. Peasant children, by contrast, had uneven cuts, often left long until practicality demanded a trim. In them, the simplicity of class was visible from the earliest age. A child's hair could foretell the life they were destined for, the polished care of wealth or the rough efficiency of labor. What seems unusual to us today, bowl cuts with sharp edges, shaved crowns, or long locks left unkempt, was deeply tied to class in the Middle Ages. A haircut was not simply about preference, but about the tools one could afford, the time one could spare, and the social world one inhabited. Nobles displayed their place through elegance, townsfolk through neat respectability, peasants through endurance. All of it combined into a visual code, understood by everyone, spoken without words each time two people crossed paths. And so, hair in medieval Europe was not only a personal choice. It was a mirror of social class, a strand in the great fabric of hierarchy. From the smooth cuts of nobles to the rough shears of peasants, each style carried meaning, each haircut a statement of belonging. To walk among them was to read a silent map of society, drawn not on parchment but on the very heads of its people. The empire of rank was written in hair, and though the styles may appear unusual now, they spoke clearly in their time, reminding all who saw them of where they stood in the order of the world. In the long sweep of medieval Europe, where villages rested beneath stone towers and cathedrals stretched their spires toward the sky, few images are as striking or as curious as the shaved heads of monks. To modern eyes, these haircuts, circles cut into the crown, or heads shaven smooth, appear unusual, almost strange. Yet in their own time, these styles were deeply meaningful, filled with symbolism, duty, and quiet discipline. Hair was not merely hair within the cloisters. It was a marker of devotion, a visible sign of a life turned away from worldly vanity and given to a higher rhythm of obedience and humility. The style most often remembered is the tonsure, a haircut where the crown of the head was shaved, leaving a ring of hair around the scalp like a pale halo of flesh bordered by dark strands. This circular shape was not chosen for fashion, but for meaning. It marked the monk as someone apart from ordinary life, someone who had stepped into a world of rules and rituals, where individuality gave way to discipline. The sight of a tonsured head, bowed over a book in a scriptorium, or moving slowly in prayer through cloisters, was a silent reminder of separation. To shave the crown was to let go of vanity, to accept humility, to wear one's devotion openly for all to see. The act of shaving was itself ritualized. When a man entered a monastery, his hair was cut as a sign of leaving behind his old life. The scissors or razor passed across his scalp with deliberate care, not simply to remove hair, but to mark transformation. The clippings fell to the ground like pieces of the self, small strands of the world left behind. What remained was the circle of the tonsure, a crown of humility in place of worldly crowns of gold or silver. The symbolism was quiet but powerful. To rule oneself through obedience was greater than ruling others with power. There were variations, too, across regions of Europe. In some places, monks shaved the entire head, leaving no hair at all. The smooth scalp shone in the light, a total renunciation of appearance, an even clearer mark of humility. In others, the ring was kept thicker, wider, more distinct, a style that to our eyes looks unusual, even odd, but that in its time carried serious meaning. These variations reflected local traditions, different interpretations of what humility and devotion should look like. To travel across Europe was to see these different forms, each slightly altered, each still carrying the same weight of purpose. Daily life for monks reinforced the meaning of these haircuts. Within monasteries, where silence often ruled and labor was constant, hair was not to be an ornament. It was not styled with ribbons, not perfumed with oils, not left long to blow in the wind. It was kept in its unusual shape, renewed again and again with careful shaving. Each time the razor passed across the scalp, it was a reminder. The monk's life was not his own, but part of a larger whole. The circle of shaved skin was like the circle of monastic life itself. Endless, disciplined, steady. To outsiders, the sight could be startling. Villagers who glimpsed monks passing along roads or traveling through towns saw immediately who they were. The tonsure was as clear as a badge, as unmistakable as a uniform. A shaved crown did not need words. It spoke silently of dedication and belonging to a life apart. Even those who did not fully understand the rituals of monastic life recognized the haircut as something unusual, something that marked a man as different, as set apart from the world of fields, markets, and courts. The unusualness of the style did not mean it lacked dignity. In illuminated manuscripts, monks are often shown with their tonsures clearly depicted, the ring of hair framing their heads as they bent over books or lifted their faces in quiet thought. Artists drew the detail not to mock, but to mark. It was part of identity, as recognizable as the robes they wore or the cloisters they walked. The ring of hair became a symbol of learning, for monasteries were centers of knowledge, preserving texts, copying manuscripts, and teaching those who came within their walls. To see a tonsured head was to see not only devotion but also wisdom. Practical reasons also shaped the haircut. Shaving the crown kept hair short, easier to clean and less troublesome in the close quarters of monastic living. Lice and dirt were constant challenges in the medieval world, and keeping hair controlled was a way of keeping health and balance. The tonsure was therefore both symbolic and practical, its unusual look the result of combining devotion with necessity. But the haircut also carried weight beyond the monastery. It was used to distinguish clerics from laypeople, teachers from students, the devoted from the ordinary. In courts and councils, a shaved head carried authority of a different kind, one that did not come from wealth or land, but from knowledge and learning. Monks traveled to advise kings, to record chronicles, to teach young nobles, and wherever they went, their unusual haircut marked them unmistakably. Imagine the scene of a medieval monastery is to see rows of tonsured heads bent in prayer, the light of candles flickering over circles of bare scalp. It is to hear the soft scrape of razors as younger monks carefully shaved older brothers, keeping the circle neat. It is to feel the cool touch of morning air on skin newly exposed, the faint sting of steel against flesh. It is to sense the quiet rhythm of life in which such haircuts were not curiosities, but part of the daily order, accepted, repeated, meaningful. To us, these shaved crowns may seem odd, even comical, but within their time, they were solemn, powerful, and deeply human. They were part of a language of devotion, a reminder that hair was not only about beauty, but about identity, humility, and belonging. The monks' haircuts remind us that even something as ordinary as hair can carry extraordinary meaning, shaping not only appearance, but life itself. And so, in the story of medieval hair, the tonsure holds a place apart. It was not a style chosen for vanity, not a cut made for fashion, but a symbol worn in flesh, renewed again and again with razor and discipline. It was a crown of humility, an unusual circle that told the world of a life given to something beyond the self. Strange to us, familiar to them, it endures as one of the most striking reminders of how even hair can carry the weight of history. In the world of medieval Europe, where castles stood like watchful guardians over valleys, where banners snapped in the wind above armored men, and where noble families measured their power in land and loyalty, hair was never just hair. Among knights and nobles, it was an emblem of refinement, a mark of class, and a silent statement of authority. To dress finely was not enough. To maintain one's hair in a deliberate way was to signal one's place at the very top of society. What peasants left rough and monks shaved to nothing, the nobility shaped, combed, and displayed as an extension of their prestige. When we imagine the medieval knight, we often think of the shining helm, the glint of steel armor, the heavy sword at his side. Yet beneath the helmet lay carefully maintained hair. Knights rarely allowed their locks to become wild, for their position demanded discipline not only in battle but in appearance. Many wore their hair at medium length, brushed, and even, sometimes cut just above the shoulder. This length allowed hair to fall neatly around the face when armor was removed, giving a dignified air. A knight dismounting at a banquet after campaign, helmet in hand, revealed hair that, though tousled by war, still bore the cut of care. Even in the roughest moments, Knights were aware that they were symbols, and their hair was part of that symbol. For noblemen, fashion played a more direct role. In the courts of Europe, appearance was a language of power. A nobleman's haircut could separate him from the merchant aspiring to rise in status, from the peasant bound to the soil, from the monk bound to humility. Smooth trims, evenly cut bangs across the forehead, or longer locks carefully combed behind the ears all carried unspoken messages. To maintain such hair required servants, combs of bone or ivory, oils that softened and perfumed, luxuries unavailable to most. The very neatness of noble hair was a declaration. Here was someone who need not cut his hair in haste by firelight after a day in the fields, but someone who had time, means, and attendance to shape it with patience. Noble women's hair spoke even more clearly. It was often the most visible canvas of fashion in their world, one of the few parts of the body not always covered by layers of cloth and silk. Ladies of rank rarely left their hair plain. Instead, they braided it intricately, sometimes weaving ribbons through the strands, sometimes covering it with fine veils that shimmered faintly in the light. In some courts, women's hair was drawn high upon the head, coiled into elaborate structures that showed both skill and wealth. In others, it was parted carefully, smoothed, and plaited with exact symmetry. The unusual shapes that strike us as curious today were in their own time admired as elegance. A noblewoman's hair was more than beauty. It was a crown of its own, a signal of lineage, wealth, and refinement. These styles were not constant. Fashion shifted slowly across decades, moving from shorter to longer cuts, from loose locks to tightly controlled braids. What never changed was the meaning. Noble hair was always a marker of difference. In banquet halls lit by torches and candles, hair glistened with oil, framing faces as conversations flowed. In courts where alliances were forged, or marriages were arranged, hair was one of the details that whispered of breeding and grace. To arrive unkempt was unthinkable. To arrive with hair shaped and polished was to reinforce one's place in the fragile balance of power and reputation. The maintenance of such hair was itself a labor. Servants combed and brushed, applying oils pressed from olives or herbs, sometimes perfumed to mask the odors of daily life in stone halls. Razors and shears trimmed the edges, keeping lines neat. Noble households sometimes had attendants skilled specifically in the art of grooming, for hair was not a private matter, but a public one. A nobleman presenting himself at court or a lady entering a feast carried not only the weight of their name, but the reflection of their household's discipline. Hair, like armor or jewels, became part of the display of order, wealth, and refinement. For knights, hair also carried a practical edge. In war, long locks could be dangerous beneath helmets, catching in straps or dampening with sweat. Many knights cropped their hair to a length that balanced dignity with practicality, short enough for battle, long enough for display. The helmet's removal at a tournament or after a campaign revealed not wildness, but control. In this way, even the warrior's hair was tied to his identity, reminding all who saw him that he was not only a man of violence, but of discipline. That we must also imagine how striking these differences appeared to those outside noble circles. A peasant, watching a nobleman pass through a village, saw at once the distinction. His own hair might be uneven, roughly trimmed with a knife by his wife or by his own hand. The nobleman's, by contrast, was smooth, even, and clean, its edges sharp, its length deliberate. For a peasant woman with hair bound in a simple braid beneath a kerchief, the sight of a noble lady with hair coiled high and bound with ribbons must have seemed extraordinary, almost otherworldly. The unusual haircuts of nobility carried more than fashion. They carried separation, the visible reminder that these were people of another world. Festivals and ceremonies magnified these contrasts. At tournaments, where knights displayed skill before crowds, hair played a role in spectacle. Armor shone, banners fluttered, and when helms were removed, hair framed faces with practiced precision. At weddings and feasts, noble women competed silently in the art of hair, their styles growing taller, more elaborate, more intricate. These displays were not frivolous. They were part of the unspoken language of prestige, where every detail, from the cut of a sleeve to the shape of a braid, reinforced hierarchy. The unusual cuts and styles of nobles and knights seem strange to us now because they were born of a world where hair was not private but public, not a personal choice, but a duty to class. A noble's hair was expected to reflect discipline and grace, just as his words and deeds did. A knight's cut reflected both his readiness for battle and his place among peers. A noblewoman's elaborate hair reflected her family's wealth, her household's pride, and her own place within the delicate dance of alliances that lie in paintings and manuscripts. These styles were carefully recorded. We see men with even bangs across their foreheads, women with hair drawn into structures so high they needed veils to hold them, knights with smooth shoulder-length locks, all frozen in time. The artists did not exaggerate. They captured what was real, what was seen, what was admired. Through these depictions, we glimpsed the world of hair as it was, unusual to us, but perfectly natural to them. That to walk through a medieval noble court was to step into a world of hair as symbol. Each head was a statement. Each cut, each braid, each coil whispered of rank, duty, refinement, and ambition. In the quiet of villages, hair reflected survival. In the silence of monasteries, it reflected humility. But in the courts of knights and nobles, hair reflected prestige. It was the most visible crown they wore, renewed each day by the careful hands of servants and the quiet demands of tradition. And so, in the long story of medieval Europe, hair once again shows us that the unusual is often deeply meaningful. What looks curious now, blunt bangs, tall braids, shining locks cut to even lengths, was once the mark of power. It carried dignity, it carried weight, and it carried history. To dismiss it as fashion alone would be to miss the truth. For knights and nobles, hair was identity, displayed for all the world to see. In medieval Europe, a woman's hair was more than strands of keratin growing quietly from her scalp. It was a marker of her identity, a reflection of her place in society, and a silent language through which age, status, and custom were expressed. In a time when clothing was often simple, possessions were few, and words about private matters were rarely spoken aloud, hair carried meaning that everyone understood. To see a woman's hair was to glimpse her story, whether she was young or old, wealthy or modest, free or bound by circumstance. For girls, hair was a symbol of youth and promise. Young maidens often wore their hair long, brushing it smooth when possible, braiding it loosely, or letting it flow down their backs. The length and softness of youthful hair carried with it an unspoken message. This was a stage of life full of beginnings, not yet burdened with heavy responsibilities. In small villages, a girl's long braid or untied locks were as much a sign of her age as her playful step or her laughter in the fields. The unusual simplicity of children's hairstyles, without ornament, without complex arrangement, was itself symbolic. A mirror of innocence and the freedom of early years as women grew older. Their hair began to reflect their changing roles. Married women often shifted from the loose styles of youth to more controlled and practical arrangements. Braids became tighter, buns more common, hair drawn back firmly rather than left to fall. This change was not vanity, but duty. The discipline of hair mirrored the discipline of daily life. Women tended households, worked in markets, managed tasks that required focus and energy. Hair tied securely was not only a symbol of responsibility, but also a practical necessity, keeping strands away from food, fire, or tools. To see a woman with her hair drawn back neatly was to recognize the rhythm of her life, her place within a home, and the respect she carried in her community among the wealthier classes. Women's hair became an arena for beauty and display. Noble women arranged their hair with great care, often with the help of attendants who braided, coiled, or bound strands into intricate shapes. Ribbons, beads, and fine combs were woven into the styles, turning hair into a living ornament. Some fashions rose high above the head, requiring hours of preparation, while others smoothed the hair down into shining sheets, a reflection of refinement. To walk into a noble hall was to see hair as part of spectacle, unusual by our standards, sometimes towering, sometimes rigidly shaped, but admired in its time as elegance. For these women, hair symbolized wealth and lineage as much as dresses or jewels. It declared, silently, the resources and time that could be devoted to grooming, resources unavailable to those of lower rank. For women of modest means, symbolism lay in simplicity. A village woman's braid, though plain, was still full of meaning. It was strong, woven tightly to endure long hours of labor. It reflected care, not luxury, but still dignity. To see her hair drawn into a practical plait was to see her role in her household, hardworking, resilient, enduring. Even scraps of cloth tied around braids carried significance, for they were not only functional but expressive, showing the small touches of individuality that even modest lives embraced. In these simple choices, women told their stories, not of wealth or grandeur, but of survival, care, and pride in their endurance. Age, too, was reflected in hair. Older women often carried the visible mark of time in graying strands, hair that had lost its youthful sheen but gained a different kind of symbolism, wisdom, experience, and the quiet dignity of years. Their hairstyles were rarely elaborate, but this simplicity itself carried meaning. It showed that they had moved beyond the display of youth or the responsibilities of middle years into a stage where calm steadiness mattered most. To see a grandmother in a village with her hair bound in a simple knot was to see the history of a family carried visibly. Each gray strand another line in the story of her life. Unusual styles emerged in many regions, shaped by local custom and by slow-moving fashions that spread from courts to towns. Fringes cut blunt across the forehead, braids coiled tightly around the head, or hair drawn into shapes that to us seem odd. All of these were normal in their time. They carried symbolic messages: youth, modesty, dignity, or refinement. What looks unusual today was once perfectly legible to those who lived in the Middle Ages. Each cut, each braid, each coil was part of a shared vocabulary that people around them understood instantly. Hair also symbolized transitions in life. A girl's first braid marked her step into responsibility. A woman's graying locks marked her shift into elderhood. A new style, carefully arranged for a feast or a wedding, marked moments of celebration and change. These transitions were not spoken of in long speeches. They were seen in hair. In this way, hair became a quiet chronicle of life stages, a visible record of growth, duty, and age. Even care itself was symbolic. To brush one's hair before entering a marketplace, to arrange it neatly before a gathering, was an unspoken act of respect. It showed that a woman carried dignity not only in words, but in presence. In an age when cleanliness was difficult and luxury rare, this simple care became a powerful signal. It told neighbors and strangers alike that she valued herself, her household, and her place within the community. Imagine the world of medieval women's hair is to see a tapestry of symbolism woven from strands. Young girls with loose braids running through fields, mothers with hair drawn back firmly as they stirred pots or carried water, noble women with towering styles glinting with ribbons at feasts, older women with silver strands bound simply as they watched grandchildren play. Each head was a message, each style a story. None were meaningless, even if they now seem unusual to us. And so, In the long memory of medieval Europe, women's hair carried meanings beyond fashion. It was identity, age, duty, pride, and care. It was the crown of youth, the braid of responsibility, the knot of age, the ornament of nobility. Those centuries have passed, those styles have changed. Their symbolism still whispers to us that even the most ordinary strands of hair can carry the weight of a life, the story of a society, and the meaning of history itself. In the world of medieval Europe, the life of a child was short in years, yet filled with quiet transformations that shaped their journey toward adulthood. These transformations were marked not only in clothing, in duties, and in posture, but also in something as ordinary as hair. To the eyes of parents, neighbors, and community, the way a child's hair was cut or arranged spoke clearly of their stage of life. To us now, some of these styles may seem crude, unusual, or even amusing, yet to those who lived in that time, they carried meaning as familiar as the seasons. Hair was a signpost of growth, a living thread that revealed the passing from innocence to responsibility in early childhood. Hair was often left simple, sometimes almost untouched. Infants and toddlers wore soft, fine strands that grew naturally, trimmed only when they became long enough to tangle or fall into the eyes. A mother might smooth her child's hair gently with her hand, tie it back with a small piece of cloth, or cut it unevenly with the same knife used for household tasks. Symmetry was not important. Survival and care were. The uneven edges, the rough cuts, were marks of home life, signals that the child was cared for within the circle of family rather than prepared for public display. These first styles carried a symbolism of tenderness, a reminder that the child was still sheltered, not yet measured by the strict expectations of society. As children grew older, their hair began to take on more deliberate forms. For boys, the most common cut was simple, a rough, bowl cut, shaped by placing a round vessel over the head and trimming around its edge. To us, it may seem unusual, almost comical, yet it was practical. It kept the hair short, out of the way, and easily maintained by parents with little time or specialized tools. For medieval villagers, this haircut was a clear sign of childhood, seen instantly in every marketplace or village lane. A boy's bowl cut told others that he was not yet a man, not yet bound to the duties of the plow, the workshop, or the guard. It carried innocence, but also the expectation that one day the bowl would be set aside and the hair cut more carefully. Marking his step into youth, girls often wore their hair longer, brushed smooth when possible, tied loosely in ribbons of cloth, or gathered into single braids. The braid, though simple, held meaning. It showed that the girl was growing, learning to take on small tasks, learning to care for herself. A neatly braided strand, even when done by a mother or older sister, was a signal of preparation for the future. It carried symbolism beyond appearance. A braid was control, order, and patience, virtues that girls were expected to develop as they moved toward womanhood. In some regions, girls were encouraged to braid their own hair once they were old enough, a quiet rite of passage seen not in ceremony, but in daily life. Seasons too shaped children's hair. In summer, boys might have their hair cropped closer to bring relief from heat and dirt. In winter, hair was sometimes left longer, giving warmth and protection against the cold. These changes were practical, yet they also marked time, reminding families of how their children grew season after season. Each trim was a small moment of care, a sign that parents were watching over their child's well-being. Even this ordinary act became symbolic. Haircuts tied children not only to family, but to the rhythm of nature itself. Among wealthier families, children's hair carried different meanings. Noble boys often wore their hair neatly shaped, trimmed evenly, showing that their lives were not spent in rough labor, but in households where servants or attendants had time to smooth every strand. Noble girls might wear ribbons of finer cloth, beads woven into braids, or hair styled to echo the fashions of their mothers. These details, though small, signaled status. A well-kept haircut declared wealth just as clearly as fine clothing. It told others that the child belonged to a household of privilege, where even youth was polished and prepared for public eyes. The symbolism of hair became sharper as children neared adolescence. For boys, longer or more carefully shaped cuts began to replace the blunt bowl. A fringe trimmed straight across the forehead or locks smoothed to the side indicated that childhood was ending, that the boy was stepping into youth where expectations of labor, loyalty, and duty grew heavier. For girls, hair grew into fuller braids, sometimes doubled or wound higher on the head, showing that they were moving beyond the innocence of early years into the responsibilities of maturity. These changes were not only noticed by family, but by the entire community. In small villages, everyone knew when a boy's cut had changed, when a girl's hair was braided differently. These changes signaled that the child was growing up, ready for new tasks, new roles, and in time, a new place within society. Festivals and special days highlighted these transitions. On feast days or at fairs, parents might take more care with children's hair. Boys' cuts were brushed and smooth, girls' braids tied with brighter cloth. These were not luxuries, but acts of pride, signals to neighbors that their children were cared for, healthy, and prepared for the next stage of life. Hair became part of celebration, a visible mark of belonging to the joy of the community. To see children with neatly prepared hair at such events was to see the promise of the future, carried in small heads among the larger crowd. That children's hair also carried the symbolism of vulnerability. In paintings and manuscripts, children are often shown with softer, looser hair than adults, a reminder that they were not yet hardened by the burdens of life. Their hair marked them as needing protection, needing guidance. For parents, this symbolism was deeply felt, even if unspoken. To smooth a child's hair before sending him to the fields to help or before sending her to carry water was not only a gesture of grooming, but of care. A silent hope that their child would endure and thrive. The unusual haircuts of childhood, the uneven trims, the blunt fringes, the simple braids, all told the same story of growth, of change, of time moving steadily forward. Each stage was visible not in grand ceremonies, but in small daily details. A boy's bowl cut, a girl's first braid, an older child's smoother style. These were the silent milestones of life in medieval Europe. They marked not only age, but expectation, showing both the innocence of youth and the preparation for adulthood that lay ahead. To walk through a medieval village was to see these differences instantly. Younger children darted through lanes with hair unkempt from play. Older children stood with more deliberate cuts, their hair showing that they were ready for more serious roles. The community read these signals easily, for everyone had lived them. To us, the haircuts seemed strange, rough, even laughable. To them, they were simply the markers of life, as natural as the turning of seasons, as clear as the chiming of bells that measured each day. And so, children's hair in medieval Europe was not trivial. It was deeply symbolic, a mirror of growth, age, and belonging. It showed who was still sheltered, who was stepping into responsibility, who was nearing adulthood. It was part of the rhythm of family and community, part of the language of survival. The unusual styles were not odd to them, but meaningful, each one a strand in the larger tapestry of society. Hair, even in childhood, told a story, one that carried the quiet weight of history across generations. When we look back at medieval Europe, it is easy to imagine a single picture. Villages built of timber and stone, people in rough tunics and cloaks, everyone sharing the same look. Yet in truth, Europe was a patchwork of lands and cultures, each with its own climate, customs, and quiet traditions. This diversity could be seen not only in architecture or food, but also in hair. Regional styles gave each corner of the continent its own character, And some of these choices, when viewed today, strike us as unusual, even curious. But in their time, they carried meaning as natural as the soil beneath one's feet that in the northern regions, where winters were long and harsh, hair often grew longer, serving not only as fashion but also as warmth. Men allowed their locks to fall to their shoulders, thick and heavy, while women wore braids wrapped close against the head to protect them from the chill winds. The styles may appear simple, but they were shaped by climate as much as by taste. Even children's hair was left fuller during the cold months, the strands tucked into fur caps or woolen hoods. A traveler moving northward would have noticed at once how hair seemed thicker, heavier, adapted to the biting air. What might have looked wild or unkempt to someone from a warmer land was, to the people of the north, simply sensible. In contrast, the southern lands of Europe, where sun and heat pressed down upon towns and fields, saw hair worn differently. Men often cropped their hair shorter, seeking relief from sweat and dust. Women tied their hair higher, lifting braids and coils to keep the neck cool, sometimes binding them in scarves of light fabric. These regional habits gave life to distinctive looks. A traveler arriving from the north, with long hair falling heavy across his shoulders, would stand out in a southern marketplace, where most men kept their hair close-cropped. The difference was not merely aesthetic but practical. Yet over time, practicality became fashion, and fashion became identity. In Western regions, particularly in some coastal towns, unusual fringe styles became popular. Men and boys alike wore their hair cut straight across the forehead, often at eyebrow level, with the rest left longer at the sides. To modern eyes, this blunt style looks peculiar, even severe, but in its time it was admired as neat and youthful. Portraits and manuscripts show rows of men with identical fringes, their brows lined with hair cut as evenly as the edge of a blade. Among women, variations appeared as well. Some chose to cut the hair at the temples shorter, leaving a contrast between smooth foreheads and long braids behind. These regional details spread slowly, carried by merchants and travelers, but often remained tied to particular valleys or towns. To see such a cut was to recognize not only fashion but geography. In Central Europe, where trade routes crossed and cultures mixed, hair reflected variety. Some towns favored longer, looser styles, influenced by travelers who passed through from distant regions. Others adopted unusual ways of binding hair, with braids wound in circles over the ears or tied into loops at the nape of the neck. To us, these styles might seem eccentric, even impractical, but they were admired as signs of belonging. In markets where languages mingled and goods arrived from far-off lands, hair became another way of expressing identity. A stranger could often be placed not only by his accent, but by the way his hair was cut or tied. Eastern regions displayed their own peculiarities. In some places, men shaved parts of the head, leaving patches of hair long, while keeping others close to the scalp. The uneven contrast carried meaning, sometimes connected to tradition, sometimes to fashion, but always marking a man as belonging to that region. To others, it might have looked strange, even wild, yet it was instantly recognizable to locals. Women in these areas often favored heavier braids, woven thick and tied with bands of colored cloth, reflecting both practicality and beauty. A traveler passing through Eastern markets would see hair as a map of custom, each style a signal of place. Even within small regions, differences appeared. Villages only a day's walk apart sometimes developed distinct habits. One town might favor hair cut short at the back, another might leave it longer, tied loosely. Women in one valley might braid their hair into a single plait, while their neighbors preferred two. These small details became part of local identity, understood instantly by those who lived there, unnoticed by outsiders until they began to travel more widely. Festivals often highlighted these regional styles. During fairs, when people from many villages gathered, Haircuts became as distinctive as dialects. Crowds of men with blunt fringes mingled with others who wore longer locks. Women with tightly wound braids stood beside those with looser, flowing styles. Each group carried its identity visibly, yet without conflict. The diversity was accepted as part of the fabric of life. To walk among such gatherings was to see not one Europe, but many Europes, each with its own silent traditions expressed through hair. Climate, geography, and custom shaped these styles, but so did imitation. A noble's unusual haircut in one region might spark curiosity in another, slowly carried by visitors and merchants until it took root in new soil. Yet even then, the borrowed style changed, adapting to local habits, blending into something unique. This constant cycle of influence created a patchwork of unusual looks that to us seem inconsistent, but to them felt natural. The unusual regional styles remind us that medieval Europe was not uniform. It was alive with differences, small but significant, carried in the way people dressed their hair. What seems odd now, blunt fringes, heavy braids, uneven shaves, was simply a reflection of place. Each strand carried geography within it. Each cut whispered of climate. Each braid spoke of belonging. To see someone's hair was often to know where they came from, what customs they followed, what land they called home. And so, when we think of medieval Europe, we must not imagine a single style, but 1,000 variations. Hair was a living map, tracing valleys, rivers, coasts, and mountains. The unusual cuts that catch our eye today were once ordinary markers of life, carrying the silent weight of identity and place. They remind us that even something as small as hair can hold the vast diversity of a continent, binding people to their land, their neighbors, and their history. In medieval Europe, life moved in rhythms set by the turning of the seasons, the pace of work in the fields, and the long cycle of cold winters and fertile summers. Yet scattered across the year were festivals, moments when ordinary life gave way to celebration, when markets filled with color, when music drifted down village streets, and when people dressed not simply for duty but for display. On such occasions, hair became more than a practical matter of keeping strands out of one's eyes or away from the smoke of cooking fires. It became a canvas of expression, a way of joining the community in its brief escape from toil. What seemed plain on ordinary days could, during festivals, be shaped, decorated, or even transformed into unusual styles that reflected joy, pride, and belonging. In villages, where tools were simple and time was often scarce, women prepared for festivals by braiding their hair more carefully than usual. Instead of a single plait tied with a strip of cloth, hair might be divided into 2 or 3 braids, woven tighter, wrapped higher, or bound with colored ribbons saved for special days. The ribbons themselves often carried meaning. A strip of red cloth might have been cut from an old garment, passed down from mother to daughter, carrying the quiet memory of family. A brighter ribbon, purchased at a market from a traveling merchant, might have signaled prosperity, a small luxury displayed proudly. To see women gathered at a festival with braids adorned in color was to see more than style. It was to see the careful preparation of families wanting to show their best to neighbors and strangers alike. Men too gave attention to their hair on festival days. The rough bowl cuts of daily life were trimmed more evenly, the edges cleaned with care. Young men sometimes let their hair fall longer in front, combed carefully across the forehead in styles that looked unusual to outsiders, but were admired within their communities. Older men might smooth their hair back with water, pressing it flat for neatness, or tie longer locks behind the head with a strip of leather. These details were small, but they spoke loudly during gatherings. A man who arrived with hair freshly, trimmed and tidy showed that he respected the occasion, that he carried pride in himself and in the festival that bound the community together. Children's hair, usually left loose or uneven, was often shaped more deliberately for celebrations. Mothers brushed it smooth, tied it with bits of thread or cloth, sometimes cutting fresh bangs across the forehead. These blunt fringes, though unusual to us, were seen as signs of care and attention. To see a row of children playing at a festival with their hair freshly brushed and tied was to see the joy of families displayed through the smallest of details. Their hair was part of the celebration, a visible marker that even the youngest members of the community belonged to the moment of festivity. In towns, festivals brought even greater variety. Merchants and craftsmen, eager to display success, often shaped their hair in ways that reflected local fashions or even borrowed styles seen in distant markets. Some wore short fringes, others longer locks, and still others unusual side parts that gave the face a distinct frame. Among women, hair was sometimes braided into elaborate crowns around the head, or lifted into coiled shapes supported with pins. Unmarried girls might let hair fall more loosely than usual, a sign of youth and vitality, while married women tightened their styles, showing dignity and restraint. These contrasts gave towns a lively appearance during festivals, where every head seemed to tell a story of status, age, and pride. Noble households carried the practice further still. During feasts and tournaments, hair became as much a part of display as clothing or jewelry. Noblemen wore their hair smoothed and shaped, often shoulder length, brushed until it gleamed in the torchlight of banquet halls. Noble women prepared for days, their attendants braiding, coiling, and pinning hair into elaborate forms that sometimes rose high above the head or stretched in wide arcs. Unusual to us, but admired in their time as symbols of wealth and refinement. Ribbons of silk, beads of glass, and even thin strands of metal were woven into the styles, turning hair into an ornament that rivaled crowns. To see noble women gathered at a feast was to see hair as art. Each had a statement of lineage and elegance. Festivals were not only about individual display, they were about community identity. Villages took pride in showing visitors their customs, and hair was part of this shared language. In some regions, women braided their hair in unique patterns, reserved for festivals, shapes that signaled where they were from. In others, young men cut fringes in ways that marked their valley or town. These unusual choices were not accidents, but symbols, ways of binding people together through visible signs. A stranger arriving at a festival could often guess the origins of a family by the way hair was styled, just as easily as by accent or clothing. The preparation for festivals was itself meaningful. Families gathered to help one another, mothers brushing daughters' hair, sisters braiding each other's strands, fathers trimming sons' cuts with knives or shears. The process took time, often done by the firelight on the evening before the celebration. Laughter, chatter, and the simple warmth of shared work filled the air. Hair became more than fashion. It became part of the ritual of readiness, a way of stepping out of daily life and into the shared joy of the coming day. Even the atmosphere of festivals magnified the symbolism of hair. By day, braids gleamed in the sunlight, ribbons fluttered as women danced, children's fringes fell into their eyes as they played games. By night, torchlight and lanterns cast shadows across smooth foreheads and shining locks, turning ordinary hair into part of the spectacle. Hair, often unnoticed in the routine of labor, became suddenly visible, part of the beauty and energy of celebration. Travelers passing through towns and villages during festivals often noted these unusual styles. To them, the variety seemed strange, even extravagant. But to locals, each braid, each fringe, each ribbon carried a meaning known and shared. It was not strangeness, but identity, a visible sign of participation in the life of the community. Festivals were times when hair could speak more loudly than on ordinary days, carrying pride, joy, and tradition in every strand. And so, hair in medieval festivals was more than decoration. It was preparation, It was identity. It was community. It showed pride in family, in place, in survival itself. The unusual cuts and styles that strike us today as peculiar were, in their time, signals of care, belonging, and celebration. They were as much a part of the festival as the music, the dancing, the laughter, and the feasting. To walk through a medieval festival was to step into a living gallery of hair, braids adorned with ribbons, fringes cut freshly across young brows, noble styles rising high like ornaments of wealth, children's locks brushed smooth for once. Every head carried meaning, every style a reflection of joy. In those moments, hair became not just a personal detail, but a shared expression of life, woven into the great fabric of medieval celebration. Medieval Europe was a world shaped by work. From dawn until dusk, the rhythm of life was measured not by leisure, but by labor, tending crops, mending tools, grinding grain, weaving cloth, raising livestock, or building stone by stone. Survival depended on the body's endurance, and every detail of daily life was tied to that reality. Even hair, something we often consider personal, even decorative, was shaped by the demands of survival. To the medieval mind, hair was not only identity or fashion. It was also a practical element of work, a tool to be managed, an obstacle to control, a feature that could reveal much about how one lived from day to day. For men, work dictated simplicity. Farmers, the backbone of rural life, often wore their hair short and blunt. Long locks could fall into the eyes while plowing, could catch in the wind while carrying tools, or could drip sweat into the soil as fields were tilled. A shortcut meant less distraction, less danger, and easier maintenance. Yet these cuts were not refined, not shaped by fine shears or polished mirrors. They were uneven, hacked with knives or trimmed by wives at home, more practical than aesthetic. The roughness of these haircuts carried meaning. It was not neglect, but proof of a life in constant labor. A head of unevenly cut hair was a silent badge of survival, an emblem of endurance worn proudly without needing to be spoken of. Craftsmen shaped their hair according to their trades. Blacksmiths, working near sparks and smoke, often kept their hair tied back or cropped shorter to avoid accidents at the forge. Carpenters and masons sometimes let their hair grow slightly longer, but bound it behind their heads with strips of cloth to keep it from falling across their faces as they worked. Millers, constantly surrounded by the fine dust of ground grain, preferred shorter cuts, for long hair quickly became clogged with flour. Each trade left its quiet mark on the head, and neighbors could often guess a man's occupation not only by the tools he carried, but by the way his hair was kept. The unusual practicality of these styles, plain and direct, told a story of work that consumed more time than grooming ever could. For women, hair was equally bound to labor. Village women, who carried water, spun thread, baked bread, and helped in the fields, wore their hair tightly braided or bound in simple buns. Loose hair was a danger. It could fall into dough, into flames, into spinning wheels, or simply into one's eyes at the wrong moment. A braid, though plain, was a symbol of readiness, a style that kept strands controlled while leaving both hands free. Cloth bands or kerchiefs added another layer of protection, keeping hair clean and secure during long hours of labor. To see a woman with hair bound tightly against her head was to see someone prepared for survival, her style not a luxury, but a necessity. Children, too, reflected this practicality. Boys had rough bowl cuts, short enough to stay out of their way when they began simple chores, carrying wood, herding animals, or helping with planting. Girls had braids tied quickly each morning, strands pulled firmly back to keep them neat during games that were often as physical as work itself. Even at young ages, hair mirrored daily life, teaching children that appearance was tied to responsibility, that even something as ordinary as a braid was part of the discipline of survival. Seasonal rhythms added further layers to this connection. In summer, When labor in fields was heaviest, hair was cropped shorter to bring relief from heat and sweat. In winter, when cold winds swept across villages and towns, men and women alike allowed their hair to grow longer, pulling it beneath hoods, caps, or scarves to preserve warmth. The length of hair was not only style but adaptation, proof of how survival shaped every strand. Festivals and markets provided a sharp contrast to this daily practicality. A farmer who usually kept his hair blunt and short might smooth it down with water before walking into town, presenting a neater image. A woman whose hair was normally tied in a simple braid might add a ribbon or shape her bun more carefully for the occasion. These changes, though modest, were highly symbolic. They showed that daily survival left space, however small, for dignity, pride, and a sense of belonging to the community. In this way, hair became a bridge between labor and life, carrying both practicality and expression. Unusual regional habits also grew out of work itself. In fishing villages, men sometimes shaved the back of their heads to keep long hair from tangling in nets or ropes, creating a look that to outsiders seemed strange but was perfectly logical to those who lived by the sea. In mountainous regions, where winds blew fiercely, braids and tied hair were more common among both men and women, keeping strands secure against sudden gusts. These regional practices were practical solutions that evolved into local traditions, so that what began as necessity became custom, passed down across generations. Hair also bore the marks of hardship. In times of famine or plague, when labor grew heavier and survival more uncertain, grooming often fell away. Hair grew longer, unkempt, ragged at the edges. To see such hair was to recognize not neglect but crisis, a visible reminder that life had pressed too hard for care. Conversely, when times improved, people took more effort with their hair, trimming and braiding with greater attention, signaling recovery and stability. Hair was therefore not only a mirror of work, but a mirror of fortune, reflecting the ebb and flow of survival. Even in towns and cities, where trades and markets created more specialized lives, hair still revealed the tie between labor and appearance. Shopkeepers, scribes, and apprentices might keep their hair more polished, yet even there, practicality mattered. A scribe bending over parchment needed hair tied back or trimmed to keep it from brushing across ink. A cook in a tavern needed strands bound away from fire and food. The unusual cuts seen in illustrations, blunt bangs, thick locks, tied bundles, were shaped as much by survival as by style. Imagine daily life in medieval Europe is to see hair in constant motion with work. Men cutting wood with sweat running into short, uneven fringes. Women kneading dough with braids tucked firmly under cloth. Children chasing animals with strands falling into eyes despite rough bowl cuts. These were not moments of vanity, but of endurance, each head telling the story of how survival shaped every detail. What seems unusual now, the bluntness, the roughness, the severe practicality, was simply the mark of life itself. And so, hair in medieval Europe was not trivial. It was part of survival, tied to labor, shaped by duty, influenced by climate, and marked by fortune. To see a person's hair was to see the story of their work, their place, and their struggle. The unusual styles that seem odd to us now were once signals of resilience, badges of endurance worn quietly by people who asked only to live another day. Hair was as much a part of survival as bread, fire, or shelter, humble, practical, and deeply human. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often picture stone castles, wooden cottages, narrow streets, and endless fields. But within that world, hair was a thread running quietly through every life. It grew and was cut, it was bound and adorned. It changed with the seasons of age, with the demands of work, with the joys of festivals. And though it seems so ordinary, hair carried with it the memory of a person's journey and the legacy of a society. It was never only fashion. It was history, written strand by strand. Hair could mark the passage of time more clearly than words. A child's uneven bowl cut, jagged from the hands of a mother's knife, gave way to the smoother lines of youth, then to the careful trims of early manhood. A girl's long, loose strands, brushed in the evenings by her sisters, shifted into braids that spoke of maturity, responsibility, and care. Later still, streaks of gray threaded through the hair of men and women, symbols of years endured, of lessons carried. In every stage, hair told the story of change. These changes were not recorded in parchment or stone, but lived visibly on every head in every village and town. Families remembered their lives through hair in ways we rarely consider. A lock of a child's first haircut might be saved, tied with thread, kept as a memory of youth before work and responsibility transformed them. Sisters braided one another's hair, and years later those same braids were recalled in the patterns passed on to daughters. Fathers cut the hair of sons, rough and uneven, but in those cuts was a memory of care given, of lessons shared by the firelight. Even when no words were spoken, the act of grooming became a form of memory, one that bound families together silently through generations. Hair also held legacy in communities. Regional styles, unusual and distinctive, became markers of place. A braid wound high around the head, a fringe cut sharply across the forehead, or hair bound beneath cloth in a particular way told neighbors where someone came from, what valley or village they belonged to. Over time, these styles became traditions, passed on from one generation to the next, transforming into a quiet legacy of identity. To wear hair in the style of one's ancestors was not simply to follow fashion, but to honor belonging. To keep alive a memory of community.in towns and noble courts. Hair carried another kind of legacy, the legacy of prestige. The elaborate coils of noble women, supported by ribbons and pins, spoke of lineage and household. A nobleman's neat trim or a knight's controlled locks beneath a helmet signaled not only personal pride, but the continuation of a family's place in society. These styles were remembered, painted in manuscripts, carved in stone effigies, and described in chronicles. They became part of how we today remember medieval identity, their unusual shapes frozen in art as lasting echoes of their time. Even in hardship, hair carried memory. During times of famine or sickness, when grooming was neglected, long unkempt hair became a record of suffering, a reminder of the weight of survival. When times improved, the simple act of trimming hair, of braiding it neatly again, became a symbol of recovery, of hope renewed. These changes, visible to everyone, left memories carried not in documents, but in human appearance. They showed resilience, the ability of people to endure and then restore dignity even after hardship. Hair was also a way of remembering individuals. Friends and family recognized one another by the way their hair was kept, by a braid worn a certain way, by a fringe that framed a familiar face. In an age without photographs, without portraits for most, these details became part of memory. A father might be recalled as the man with thick, dark hair tied back with leather, a mother as the woman whose silver braid gleamed in the firelight. To remember someone's hair was to remember their presence, their gestures, their life. When they were gone, these memories remained, quiet but enduring in a broader sense. Hair itself became part of the legacy of the Middle Ages. The unusual cuts and styles, strange to our eyes, tell us today about who these people were, what they valued, and how they lived. A blunt bowl cut speaks of practicality and labor. A tall coil braided high speaks of wealth and display. A simple braid bound with scraps of cloth speaks of endurance and care. Each style is a voice from the past, reminding us that even the smallest details carry meaning. The legacy of medieval hair also lies in how it shaped the future. Styles evolved slowly, passed down, borrowed, adapted. What began as a practical choice in one region became fashion in another. What nobles wore in courts trickled down in simpler forms to towns and villages. What peasants created for practicality sometimes rose to nobility as a mark of rustic charm. These cycles of influence remind us that hair was never fixed, but always alive, always changing, always carrying forward the legacy of the people who wore it. And when we look back now, centuries later, we find ourselves surprised, even amused, by the unusual cuts recorded in paintings and manuscripts. Yet behind each strange fringe or towering braid was a person, living in a world of hardship and joy, of labor and celebration. Their hair tells us not only about style, but about survival, identity, memory, and legacy. It tells us that even in the quiet details of life, history leaves its mark. To walk through a medieval village in our imagination is to see hair as more than fashion. It is to see memory, worn each day, growing and changing with the seasons of life. It is to see legacy, passed from parent to child, from community to community, across centuries. The unusual haircuts of the Middle Ages are therefore not only curiosities. They are living echoes of lives once lived. Reminders that history is written not only in grand deeds, but in the smallest of human details. And so, hair in medieval Europe was not forgotten, even when the people themselves passed away. It carried memory, it carried legacy, it carried the silent story of survival and belonging. In every lock cut and every braid tied, in every fringe trimmed and every silver strand that appeared with age, hair was history, humble, human, and enduring. As the journey through medieval Europe's unusual haircuts draws to an end, we find ourselves reflecting on how something as simple as hair could carry so much meaning. At first glance, a blunt bowl cut, a tightly wound braid, or an oddly shaped fringe may seem trivial or even comical to our modern eyes. Yet within those styles lay the weight of survival, the whispers of identity, and the shared language of entire communities. Hair was never only decoration. It was survival in the fields, discipline in the household, pride in the marketplace, and spectacle in the courts. It was the mark of childhood innocence, the sign of adult responsibility, and the badge of age and wisdom. It was memory carried from one generation to the next, a living thread that bound people not only to their families, but to their places, their neighbors, and their history. We have walked through villages where children played with freshly cut fringes, through markets where merchants displayed careful trims, through feasts where noble women rose like ornaments of elegance, their hair woven into intricate crowns. We have seen festivals where ribbons fluttered in braids, where men and women shaped their hair with pride, where even the poorest found joy in the simplest of adornments. We have seen hardship too, when hair grew wild, unkempt, marked not by neglect, but by survival in the hardest of times. And in all of this, we see legacy. The unusual cuts of the Middle Ages remind us that history is not only written in chronicles or carved in stone. It is written in the smallest of details, in strands trimmed by firelight, in braids tied before dawn, in silver hair gleaming under torchlight. These details, humble and human, carry the memory of people who lived centuries before us, reminding us that they too cared, endured, celebrated, and hoped. So, as we close this quiet exploration, let us remember that history often hides in the ordinary. In the strands of hair that grew, were cut, and grew again, lies a story of survival and belonging. In the unusual haircuts of medieval Europe, we find not strangeness but humanity, the same desire to be recognized, to endure, to mark the stages of life. The people of the past have long faded, but their legacy lingers, woven into art, into manuscripts, into memory, and in the stillness of reflection, we hear their story, a story told not in grand speeches but in the quiet language of hair.